Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final two sessions of the Extraordinary Technology Conference 2017. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to a first-year speaker here at the conference, Darren Colomb. He's going to be speaking on Walter Russell's New Science of Tomorrow. He's a Chief Science Officer for the University of Science and Philosophy, and he hails from Virginia. He has a bachelor's in molecular biology and did underground work in plant genetics. He studied the work of Louis Kervran, documenting biological transmutation of elements, and that led him to study Walter Russell, which he will be presenting on now. Thank you very much, Darren Colomb.
Thank you. Good morning. How's everybody doing? So Walter Russell's New Science of Tomorrow. I call this a Rosetta Stone for understanding next level technology because, as Alan has pointed out, this is a completely new conceptual understanding of the universe and our relationship to it. And as a consequence of that, our technology will reflect this deeper and greater understanding. This is just an agenda of what I'd like to cover. We'll have an opening thought. We'll look a little bit about who was Walter Russell. We'll look at why we should consider his cosmogony. We're going to look at some similarities of Dr. Russell and Nikola Tesla. This is, after all, a Tesla-inspired event. We're going to look at this new science versus the old. Then we're going to get into some fun stuff with inventions and experimental evidence that I've done in the laboratory. So this is my opening thought. I thought this was quite appropriate. In February 1893, in a lecture called On Light and Other High-Frequency Phenomena, Nikola Tesla had this to say about electricity. He said, "The day when we shall know exactly what electricity is will chronicle an event probably greater, more important than any other recorded in the history of the human race." And then in 1953, Walter Russell supplies us with the definition of electricity. He says, "Electricity is an effect of strain, tension, and resistance caused by the energy of desire and the light of mind to divide and extend the balanced unity of the one still light of universal mind into pairs of many divided units of mind thinking." So here we see that electricity has everything to do with mind and thinking. Fascinating concept. Off to a good start. So who was Walter Russell? He is widely known as the most versatile man in America. He was also called the modern Leonardo, meaning Leonardo da Vinci, and also the man who tapped the secrets of the universe. That was the description given by Glenn Clark, who's written a wonderful biography on Walter Russell's life. As Alan pointed out previously, he was an author, he was a sculptor, painter, musician, sportsman, architect, figure skater, and on top of all that, a master scientist. He was conferred a doctorate of science, and we'll get into some of the reasons why that was, but he was not formally educated past fourth grade. Despite all of this, he went on to excel in every single endeavor that he wished to embark upon, which is truly inspiring and amazing. He was an artist turned a scientist. He was the creator of the Russell cosmogony. Cosmogony meaning basically the concept of the construction and birth of our universe, as opposed to a cosmology, which is dealing with sort of studying what's already there. He was one of the only men in modern history who has been enabled to vision both the visible and the invisible universes as one consistent whole, and thus know the Creator's purposes, processes, and methods of producing his universal body, without being deceived by the illusions of matter and motion which have led observers throughout the ages into forming wrong conclusions. This is why we should pay attention to what he has to say. We need to understand cosmic illumination. There's a graphic on the left there that's not there, but that's okay. Cosmic illumination was an event that transpired in Walter's life, beginning from an early age, but it culminated in 1921 in a 39-day extended period. It's difficult for us to comprehend this experience because it's so infrequent. This only happens to a few people, a handful of people in recorded history. But despite the rarity of the event, it's probably one of the most profound spiritual and divine experiences that can happen to a person. And it happened to Walter, who was a master artist. And this was for a very specific reason. In his own words, he was taken behind the scenes by God to be shown how exactly the universe comes into existence. And the purpose for this was because he had the skills to actually put this down into paintings and written form in order to surmount an impossible task of trying to explain to people how it is that mind creates matter. One thing I want to point out here about this experience, if you notice that the human being is bilateral, meaning we have an axis of symmetry that cuts us directly down this midline, as drawn by this dotted line here. And exactly in line with this line is the pineal gland, the very center of the brain. Walter described that this experience began with a flash in the pineal gland, at which point the hemispheres of his brain were short-circuited together. He was no longer subjected to the illusion of reality, which is that we see everything as duality, simply because we have two eyes, two nostrils, two ears, two limbs, two legs, etc. The significance of this is that if we can, for a moment, forget the axiom in modern physics that we have four fundamental forces, if you just say, well, let's just assume for a moment that we have one force. If we have a duality of senses, then we will always interpret one force as two. And Walter, during his experience, was no longer subjected to the duality. He could actually see the knowing cause as opposed to the dynamic thinking process, which is what we experience when we're awake. So the limitation of senses were gone during this period. And that's how he was given all of his knowledge of chemistry and physics. He had no knowledge of any of this until the end of that 39-day experience, in which case he possessed knowledge that was far greater than any other physicist, chemist, what have you, of his time. So he believed very much so that every man has unlimited power to do what he desires to do, and that whatever he does, he should excel in it. And this, of course, is part of the inspiration of his work. So why should we pay attention to what he said? Well, for one thing, when I first read his book, I was unaware of the existence of any other periodic table of elements other than Mendeleev's chart. I saw this spiral chart for the first time, and I knew immediately it was correct and that the old one was incorrect, because there's more information encoded in this chart than the Mendeleev chart contains. What's fascinating is that he says that hydrogen, which is the number one element in the Mendeleev chart, is actually the 18th element. And so in lecturing to scientists of that time, he basically told them, hey, if you poke around with hydrogen, you'll probably find other elements. And they did, except they called them isotopes. They named them deuterium and tritium, which were obviously not the names that he gave them. So he did not receive credit for this, nor did he receive credit for the discovery of plutonium and neptunium, which are located here in the 9th octave. What's fascinating about this is he's actually giving you two different views of the exact same chart, meaning in one sense you can look down on it like looking down through water going down a drain, seeing the spiral vortex, or you can look at it from the side, in which case the vortex appears to be a cone. Two different ways of looking at the same one thing. So that got my attention. I said, okay, if this man had enough knowledge to predict elements before they were discovered, obviously his knowledge exceeds that of theoretical chemistry. He was urged by a physicist of the time, H.H. Sheldon, who I believe was at Princeton, he was saying, Walter, if you can see the invisible, see the things which are unseen, that physicists cannot see, go ahead and paint it so that we can have a glimpse. And he produced this painting right here called The Wave. What's important about this is that when matter is emerging from this plane, it is projected, just like when you project an image through a two-dimensional negative to make a positive. Even this phenomenon is occurring right now from that projector in the rear. We're projecting a negative image onto a flat screen, and now all of a sudden we have dimension, we have size. If this process occurs in 3 dimensions, then we get something very similar to reality, which begs the question, what is reality if not a 3-dimensional simulation of a 2-dimensional plane? So he drew this and also shows that this is how color comes into existence, by dividing one white light or colorless light or sexless light into male and female pairs. So what does color have to do with being male and female? Everything. It has everything to do with it. This image on the right shows the wave geometry, which is the secret of creation. As he's saying, the secret of creation lies within the wave. This is literally true. This was the excerpt from page 128 in the New Concept of the Universe, which is a phenomenal book. This got my attention, and this changed my life, because he describes this experiment in which he takes 5 cc's of water vapor and is able to transmute it into different elements. Now, I had worked in chemical labs for a lot of my life. I was a chemistry TA, tutor. Worked in a chemical lab for many years. I was unaware of any method or apparatus that could take water and turn it into a different element altogether. I was familiar with hydrolysis and things like this, but this was something very, very different. And furthermore, he goes on to describe that we can mathematically work this out so that we can turn one element into any other element on command and at room temperature and pressure. So he describes this experiment that he performed in 1927, where he's saying, I demonstrated the principle of dual polarity control. And all he's using are 2 pairs of solenoids, coils. One pair had more windings than the other, in such a manner that he simulated this dual polarity of nature. And heating the tube in a furnace, inserting it into the solenoid at a certain angular relationship, the tube was then subjected to spectroscopy and analyzed, and shown that over 80% of it was hydrogen and the rest was basically helium or inert gases. There was almost no oxygen in it. So where did the oxygen go? So, and here's the original document I found. This is literally from 1927. This was at the Bloomfield, New Jersey Westinghouse Company laboratory, and it's was subject to their instrumentation and analysis. He repeated this process for them 17 different times. In every case, the resulting gas was different, meaning different from water vapor. Simply put, they could not believe the result. It didn't fit their paradigm, and so they said it could not be. said there was contamination. You did something. I know, in science we look for replication. If you can replicate the results 17 times, that means you're doing something is causing a change. It's not contamination. Okay. So let's look a little bit about Dr. Russell and Nikola Tesla. They were contemporaries. There's a quote from Leah Russell in the introduction of Atomic Suicide. She says, Nikola Tesla was, however, fully convinced that my husband's electric knowledge was true to nature, but it was so different from the accepted pattern that Tesla told him that he would have to seal it in a sepulcher with instructions that it be opened in 1,000 years when human intelligence had unfolded far enough to be ready to accept it. So here we have Tesla, the father of our modern electrical age, saying that this knowledge is beyond the present concept, and that it would take 1,000 years of mental unfolding for humanity to actually fully appreciate the depth and the breadth of this science. I really like this quote. He says here, this is Walter talking about Tesla. He said, he was an artist at heart whom the world knew as a scientist, while I was a scientist at heart whom the world knew as an artist. So they complemented each other well. And this image on the right also, he's saying, Tesla was persecuted by every conformist he ever dealt with. He alone of all my early scientist friends thoroughly believed in me. Pretty cool. Here we have an image of Mark Twain. I like this image because Tesla kind of appears to be like an apparition just from the way that the photograph was developed. And then here we see Walter working on the Mark Twain Memorial. So it's kind of a neat connection there. So these two were friends, and obviously they to be a fly on the wall and during their conversations would have been nothing short of spectacular. So let's talk about this new science, the science that Russell is proposing versus the older concepts. The fundamental difference that I want you to understand is that in this understanding of cosmogony, we have to put the creator back into his creation. A painting is not the painter, and a poem is not the poet. There's a difference here. One comes out of the other as a creative effort. In exactly the same manner, a creator created the universe. You can think of the universe as a poem or a painting or sculpture or any kind of artistic creative endeavor. And as such, there's an intelligence which is structuring and commanding and always in control of that creation. So if we don't have this as our starting premise, if we just assume that the universe somehow created itself and it's all blind energy and no focus, we're starting from the wrong premise. And therefore, every single consequence in our theoretical understanding is also completely erroneous. It's wrong from the beginning. So in brief, the Russell cosmogony is a concept of this universe as a creation of a universal mind, which is forever creating a substanceless universe of motion to simulate material body forms of mind idea. Universal mind is termed magnetic light. It is the still light which God is. It is the light of consciousness, the spiritual light, the light of balance, the light of all-knowing, and all power which inspires knowing man to seek that light. As scientists, we kind of have a problem with God, at least I'll speak for myself. When I began this endeavor, you sort of keep God out of the whole thing. So Walter has a suggestion. If you don't like using this word for whatever reason, you can have 6 synonyms that mean the exact same thing, and they are idea, intelligence, love, light, power, and law. All of these things mean exactly the same thing. It means universal mind, balance, all-knowing. So within the magnetic light is universal equilibrium. It is without sex. It is without division. It is without tension. Universal mind thinks, and motion is born. Therefore, there's nothing in our universe other than undivided and divided multiplied light, and we'll discuss what divided and then multiplied means. So the Russell cosmogony, also known as the new science of tomorrow, is a complete, consistent, and workable plan of creation which is based upon the equality of the two electric forces created by the division of the universal equilibrium into pairs of opposite pressure conditions which manifest their opposition in wave cycles. Remember I was saying earlier, from one equilibrium in that plane that divides you is seemingly two different forces. And these are the forces which create everything in our universe. So I'm going to give you a list to try to, as best I can, comprehensively cover as much of the science as I possibly can in the amount of time that I have. So this following list partially covers the misconceptions which will be corrected by adopting the new science given by Dr. Walter and Leo Russell's expanded teachings. The list also includes the mysteries and secrets which have never yet been solved and the unsuspected effects of motion regarding the construction of matter which are vital to one's comprehension of this universe, but are totally unknown. Number one, first and foremost, as I was saying before, the supreme mystery of the identity and omnipresence of God will be comprehensively clarified, so that future generations will know where to locate God in nature and cease building primitive God concepts out of their primitive imaginings. Number two, the concept of electricity as the builder of matter through the pressures of motion, in which there is no such condition as negative electricity, negative charge, or negatively charged particles. What I have here in this image is what on the top you would call this in conventional science a dipole, a positive and a negative. If we don't fix and correct this one thing, then our understanding of electricity will never be correct. What nature actually does is to create two positive conditions out of one negative condition. This is proven by a bar magnet. There is neither attraction nor repulsion in the middle of the magnet. Yet, each end of the magnet will produce some kind of force. It'll either seemingly attract or repel, depending on the proximity of another magnet or another piece of steel. So, two positive conditions come out of one negative condition. This is kind of just semantics. Negative really means to negate or void a performed action. Therefore, it really means equilibrium. And you extend from the equilibrium in two opposite directions, a positive condition. We also have to consider the new concept of atomic construction, in which there is no nucleus or nuclear group which supposedly holds the atom together from within. The atom is not pulled inward from within by the force of attraction, for there is no such force or condition in nature. Newton's concept of attraction, of gravity, seems to be the most obvious fact of nature, but nature creates many illusions, and the illusions of attraction by matter is one of the masterpieces of the illusion. It seemingly creates attraction and repulsion where there is no such condition. There is only motion going back to equilibrium. And the extension or the projection away from equilibrium is the office or the purpose function of electricity. This is literally what thinking performs. It's the only work in the universe. So we have to think now, we have to kind of revisit this concept of magnetism as it seemingly relates to electricity. This new concept of magnetism and polarity, today we have a basic understanding of electromagnetic. The universe is said to be electromagnetic, has magnetic lines of force and magnetic fields and many other terms which are based upon the belief that somehow magnetism is a force which in some way is related or associated with electricity and closes circuits, picks up iron filings on magnets, does strange things to deceive the senses of man into forming utterly wrong concepts of the nature regarding magnetism. It is true that magnetism exists, but not as a physical working force. As we've said, the only physical working force is electricity. But magnetism is a spiritually controlling, surveying, and measuring force which balances this universe in all of its creative efforts. It's akin to a scaffolding. To extend means that you get to a point where you can no longer extend and you have to retract. And that is actually termed a magnetic cube. It's a physical boundary or limitation to which motion cannot exceed. It has to be projected back to where it began. And this is what magnetism really is. We'll look at a little closer more about bar magnets, but what's termed the block wall, named after, I'm assuming, the guy who just found it first, which is what happens when you discover something in science, they get to name it after you. That is actually a magnetic plane. It's a two-dimensional plane where the power of the poles is actually borrowed and extended from. And it will have to retract to it in an orderly periodic interval. So let's look at the true nature of the electric wave versus the present electromagnetic wave. This image up here is basically what you get out of a textbook. You have electric field going up, direction of propagation going this way, and you have at a right angle the magnetic field. The real weak point here is that electromagnetism is not an existent force in nature, nor are there electromagnetic fields or magnetic fields. Wave fields are entirely electric. This is a very different understanding. And we also have to consider how the wave actually propagates. When we see a wave move outward from a source, it appears to our senses that it's moving left to right. In actuality, gravity accounts for the polarizing force, which makes it actually only move up and down, very much like a piston. In your vehicle, your pistons move up and down, and yet your car moves forward. This is kind of an analogy for the illusion of a wave propagation. It's only ever moving up and down, but it appears to move left and right. This is why we think magnetic and electric are at right angles to one another. Waves are actually projected from two sides, and they collide head-on. This collision forms what Walter calls a loop of force, or the amplitude of the wave. Beyond that point, it is no longer polarizing or generating, it's depolarizing. And that becomes a radiation to which our senses can perceive. It's quite literally a collision, and it's the same collision which produces a sound that you can hear. At a faster rate, when waves collide, then you get incandescence, which is what we see when we look at stars, or the filament of a light bulb, for example. That current is projected from two zero cathodes and is collided with one another to unite as one. So a division occurs first and then is multiplied together into unity. And that is how the universe reproduces itself. Reproduction through unity. It's no different than biological. Male and female come together and produce more male and female. Why should light be any different? The true nature of the electric wave versus the present electromagnetic waves, a little more on that. Our senses have accustomed us to believe that the direction of motion is the direction in which we see an object change position. This is not so, and it may be a long time before our unfolding intelligence arrives at this understanding. Our senses tell us that a wave shaft is moving up and down. They also tell us that they move left and right. We speak of the speed in which light waves travel, which is proof that we believe that they do in fact travel, when they actually just move up and down, as we've said. Light waves reproduce at great speed, but light does not travel at any speed. If you were one of the people who was able to see our mirror cube, we can actually demonstrate this by putting 6 mirrors at right angles. When you look into the corner, you can see, even though that the cube has a finite boundary, within it, you see an infinite extension. It goes on forever, just from the reflections of the mirror within one another, which means that light is already everywhere. It doesn't have to travel. This image is from Atomic Suicide. It's showing you the simultaneity of effects. When the universe creates expansion, it also creates contraction. When an object moves forward, an equal and opposite potential moves to meet it exactly. The best way to think about this is a pendulum. When it swings right, there's an invisible pendulum that swings to the left to equally balance it. You don't see that one, however. But when it interchanges, now they move back and forth, and now that you have the opposite where the pendulum is on this side and the evacuated space is on that side. Both things happen simultaneously. However, you only see one half of the cycle. And this is actually what accounts for our linear perception of time. Without this illusion, we wouldn't see things grow, mature, and then die. You would just see that everything is already permanently existent at once. So this is an illusion, but I call it a good illusion. It allows us to live a meaningful temporal existence, a transient existence, in a universe where actually everything is happening all at once. It's really important to understand. So we need a new concept of gravitation because it does not pull matter together from within, from the inside. It actually compresses it from the outside, just like you have to pump air into a tire. You have to force it in from the outside. You can't pull it in from within. This is what gravity is. Matter is compressed centripetally. It's heated by the consequent contraction and is frozen by the refrigeration process of space to hold it together and keep it imprisoned in its own resistance. Matter is the powder keg of the universe. It's also can be thought of as an abnormality because the real existence is equilibrium. Matter is kind of an aberration in equilibrium. Every particle of matter desires to explode outward and awaits the proper spark of ignition for its liberation from compression. The universe is founded upon the love principle. I know that doesn't sound very scientific, but love is actually the foundation of the universe. You have to kind of come to that conclusion on your own through living your own life. But it's important to realize that nature never takes. The concept of attraction of gravity is contrary to nature's purposes because the attraction of matter by matter is taking instead of giving. Matter is created by an outward explosion from a cathode to create centripetal pressures. It is then disintegrated by an outward explosion from anodes to create centrifugal pressures. So again, we're seeing a duality of force where there's really only one thing going on. Matter is constructed by compressing 4 pairs of rings into spheres at wave amplitudes. Matter is then expanded in series of rings, always in series of 4. This fact is the basis of the color spectrum of the octave wave. The contracting rings which compress and polarize are octave tones or elements of the wave, and they create spheres of matter by the way of poles. The expanding rings which depolarize matter disintegrate it centrifugally by the way of equators. So here we have action and reaction occurring at right angles to one another. And that's because of the cubic formation or the cubic shape of space, which is entirely invisible to our senses. So we need a new concept of energy. The new concept removes it entirely from either matter or motion. Einstein had the mass energy equivalence, actually was put forth by Oliver Heaviside some time before Einstein. So we have this concept that energy and mass are somehow related by the square of a speed, a cycle per second. So the present concept unifies matter and energy as the total energy present. Matter is a mind product, though. Matter has no power or knowledge. It is the universe. In this universe, there is the creator and the created, like I was saying before, the painting and the painter. That which is created has no energy within itself to create itself. The universe can't come out of nothing on its own. And that applies equally to the creation of God's universe by God as it applies to the creation of a boy's kite by a boy, or any other creative endeavor, as I've said. The motion needed for creating bodies is supplied by mind energy, the will of the mind. The electric mind energy of thinking idea into imaged forms of idea. This is what matter is. The new concept of polarity removes the positive and negative symbols from the battery terminals or from the ends of bar magnets. As I say, we're revising what we mean by a dipole. and places positive symbols at both ends. Electricity divides the sexless father-mother creator into pairs of father and mother bodies and separates one half from the other. This is a sexed electric universe. The pairs of the battery cells are male and female. The energy they seem to express is relief from the strain and separation of their divided state. Their union voids that strain and creates other father and mother bodies. This is interesting for the electrical engineers in the crowd. Let's see. An electrical short circuit is the equivalent of a sex orgasm. Think about that. All matter is created by the union of male and female battery cells. All matter is male and female, not just what we call organic living bodies. This is where I really come to appreciate my background in biology, because I can understand this immediately. So science has observed that opposite poles will unite, talking about bar magnets, but that similar ones will refuse to unite. Science interprets this fact to mean that opposite electrical charges will attract each other, while like charges will repel each other. And this is the Coulomb law to express this belief. Nature is not like that, however. Electricity is, as we said, male and female, and both are positive and equal. There is not really any meaning to the sense that a woman is negative. They're exactly equal to a man, and so they're both positive expressions of creation. They form the hemispheres of suns and planets, and each is equal. Above and below the equator, there's an equal amount of volume or compressed rings. Each hemisphere is centripetally formed by accelerative motion. Accelerative motion multiplies potential in female and male bodies alike. The underlying principle of this universe is the division of one into pairs in order that these pairs will find oneness in each other for the purpose of repeating the division. It's really only one idea, but it has this self-repeating thing, just like humans, male and females get together and we repeat the idea and more humans are come about. Up to this date, science has never considered the color spectrum of divided light as it relates to electricity, polarization, or sex. This is a universe of light, the light of mind which God is. I know I repeat that a lot, but it helps to repeat these things that eventually you start to understand the deeper meaning. You have to kind of read in between the words to really get the meaning. And the pairs of divided lights of motion, which is what sex is. If science had but considered this fact, it would not wonder why two male bodies, which are the red half of the spectrum, would not attract each other, nor why the two female bodies, which are the blue half, would not attract each other. A completed spectrum can only be produced by putting two similar halves together, nor can bodies of similar sex become one in the sense of color, incandescence. The Coulomb law is invalid, therefore, for there is no such principle of attraction and repulsion of matter in nature. In actuality, like seeks like. So science has also searched for the underlying life principle. We've looked for it in germs or primordial cells. All matter is actually alive, for matter is in motion, and motion is the simulation of living, as I've said, in a transient existence. When motion ceases, matter disappears into its invisible source. As long as there is motion in matter, it's what we would call alive. And it is positively charged. It cannot be negatively charged. As I've said, negative means to void, charge means to add to. Therefore, saying something is negatively charged is like saying adding by subtracting, which is to say that you haven't said anything at all. It's also like saying silent sound. One kind of cancels out the other. So we can't have negative charge. We can only have positive charge, and it is appropriate to say negative discharge. So electric charge cannot become negative until motion entirely ceases. This would be universal equilibrium. Motion has then become negated or voided, but it is not negative electricity. For when electricity ceases to be, it is no longer electricity. In equilibrium, you no longer have tension. And as we've seen, Russell has already defined electricity as tension. The term negative electricity is an impossible term in nature as the term silent sound, as I've said. For when sound disappears in the silence from which it sprang, it is no longer sound. The life principle of this universe is motion only. Increasing vitality and growth of living bodies is due to the accelerative motion of centripetal force. We're going to look at this when we look at some of the inventions. Decreasing vitality is due to the decelerative motion of centrifugal force. That happens on equators. You can see this in the rings of Saturn. In other words, life is multiplied potential caused by fast motion, which contracts bodies into visibility, while death is divided potential caused by slow motion, which expands body into invisibility. We're perfectly aware that our senses are very, very limited. When we see matter or incandescence come out of darkness, it simply means that the vibratory motion has entered within the realm of perception which your senses have enabled you to see. When something dies or decays or well, let's say decay as in the sense of radioactive decay, it means that it's no longer visible. Or when you boil water, you've taken it from a liquid phase into a gaseous phase, you can't see it anymore. It becomes invisible. So when we see something come in or leave our sense perception, it's simply a contraction or an expansion of vibratory motion. So let's take a look about, compare this to Tesla's belief. Tesla was asked, what about the birth of the universe? He says, matter is created from the original and eternal energy that we know as light. Does that sound familiar? It shone and appeared as a star, meaning flaming carbon. The planets, man, and everything on this planet and in the universe. Matter is an expression of the infinite forms of light because energy is older than matter. And finally, in the octave wave lies the entire secret of creation. Every detail of the construction and destruction of matter and motion is in the wave. Lack of knowledge of the wave is due to lack of knowledge of light, both invisible and visible. In the wave are the entire mechanics of all creative processes, as well as the mathematics of its two opposing pressures. To know the wave is to know all the secrets of creation. So the great unknown which awaits becoming known. Science, we must realize, is still in its infancy. Its vastness lies ahead of us. Today is primitive compared with tomorrow. Today we know how to do many things and create marvelous effects, but we don't really know the why of what we do or the cause of those effects. So the doors to a greater science will open only when we know cause. So what is there ahead still to know? The answer to this question lies in one word, and that word is cause. The New World science will be erected upon knowledge of cause, which gives one the power to control effect or predict it without tiresome and expensive and often fruitless theoretical research. Tesla says in his autobiography, My Inventions, that in the future, inventors will bypass much of the experimental by doing the work first in the concept of the mind. So here we have, he's in agreement. So let's get into some fun stuff now. Let's look at some inventions and experimental evidence. Tesla's saying that he was trying to awake the energy contained in the air. In the air, there are the main sources of energy. This is also, we can take him to mean space. What is considered empty space is just manifestation of matter that is not awakened, but yet is contained within space. There is no empty space on this planet, nor in the universe. So-called black holes, that is what astronomers talk about, are the most powerful sources of energy and life, vacuity being the source of solidity and density. Can't create one without the other. Dr. Russell said, it is a strange thing that not one of all the philosophers, mathematicians, or scientists of the ages has ever observed that all the energy of this universe is in cold, static light of space and not in matter as they believe it to be. Therefore, the Russell cosmogony is, what we're trying to do is control matter and energy by its cause in the invisible light of space instead of trying to kind of manipulate the effects of it in matter, which is sort of already kind of down the chain in the wave cycle. From this end, we want a mechanical means of demonstrating the new principle of transforming the static condition of the invisible light of space into dynamic conditions of the visible light of motion. This is a device that Walter conceived and built towards the end of his life. This project probably began around 1958 and ended when Russell died in 1963. His concept, since he was the person responsible for giving us the knowledge of the radioactive elements that we use in our nuclear reactors, he wanted to leave humanity with an alternative to having to dig up nuclear material in order to simply turn water into steam to run a turbine. If you know how matter is created, then you know how heat comes out of cold. This is a paradox for the Big Bang believers because our definition of energy is basically that it's based upon heat, and yet all of the heat came out of space, which is about as cold as it gets. So somehow heat spontaneously came out of cold with no explanation for how that process happened. So what Walter has constructed here is a double coil. It splits in the middle, as you can see. We're going to look at how this relates to Tesla's inventions, and that Tesla understood this principle of dividing one negative condition into two positive conditions. I had to study this image for a long time to realize what this is actually telling us. This is a circuit in which there's more energy present, thermal energy, meaning heat, than what the coil can produce by what you would call induction. This is because of the unique shape of the core, which you see as a conical. The turns of this coil multiply because the core keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We're compressing, as we've said, from the outside to the inside. And this process creates a huge amount of potential when you project it from both sides, 180 degrees apart. So essentially what happens is the current comes in, it divides two ways, multiplies toward the center here, and then runs up into an inductive load. So this is simply one circuit. It's just the power goes in, it comes out, runs the load. You say, okay, there's nothing weird there. But during the process, let's say this is an alternating current, there is an oscillation here which occurs at the armature. This, if you place let's call it a heat sink, or just any material which will take that fast motion and translate it into heat, you can actually enclose this thing and capture the radiant heat that comes off it while the circuit is running a load. And as such, you can get more thermal energy, more heat out of this thing than what the current's doing if you're using a cylindrical coil. One input, two outputs. You have to know how to capture this energy, however. It's not readily apparent, how to get it, but we'll show you what Walter did. So this is his Russell coil concept. It's built in accord with nature's principle of power production and power multiplication. We'll talk about what that means. And designed to double the productive power of previous coils. The image on the right here is the schematic for the device. You can see what he did is he actually enclosed the armature in a steam turbine to put the steam under high pressure to run the turbine. The water was piped in from the outside here to collide just like a wave collides at the amplitude. And again, action is along the axis, the reaction is 90 degrees to it. Action, reaction. The reaction to the compressive centripetal vortice of the coils produces an enormous amount of heat, which is then captured on the downhill flow. Science is based upon entropy right now. We have things only can run downhill. The compressive action of the stepwise function of the coil is the uphill flow of energy. We're making a large volume occupy a smaller volume. When we have gasoline in our engines, what we've done is we've taken a large volume and compressed it into a liquid. Then we ignite the liquid and it expands into gas, and we use the energy from the expansion. Why not use the expansion after you've already wound it up? Wind it up centripetally to make it more compressed toward a center point and then release the energy. Capture it and use it to run loads. So this is really no different than what's happening in a nuclear reactor, except we're bypassing the nuclear material, which is dangerous and expensive. This is a very simple way to do it. This image on the left here is the actual physical model. We found the hardware. This was a real device. The coil here you see is anywhere between 200 and 400 pounds. And there's two of them. There's one on the, toward the left here that you can't see. These were meant to be pointed at one another with an armature in the middle where the turbine was occupied. And the water was piped in through a central shaft here. And we're going to look at how this relates to some of the things that Tesla said. He also referred to this as an optical reactor or space-powered gravity reactor, but the main paper you'll see on our website, he refers to it as an optical dynamo generator. Is everybody familiar with the fact that you can take a biconvex lens on a sunny day and you can take the sunlight and focus it to a point, you can burn, grass or a piece of paper. This is an optical effect, right? We're all used to this. Well, why would a solenoid behave any different? If you can wind it up as the core is shrinking, but increase the number of turns, you will have basically, it's like stacking smaller and smaller diameter magnets. The flux, if you want to say that, is compressed from the outside toward the inside. And this leads to an increase in power. We'll show this experimentally. Here's a smaller model of the same device. Notice that the previous one consisted of 8 individual sections. This one consists of 4. This is the model that we're working with right now. We're trying to replicate this device and actually bypass the need to use the steam. I believe it's entirely possible to actually get the electric current directly out of this thing. You don't need to use the steam pressure to run the turbine, which operates the alternator to generate the power. Since this thing is a miniature replication of one cycle of an electrical current in a larger scale, as Alan was saying, the macrocosm and the microcosm are the same mechanics. Why not build one cycle of an electrical current on a tabletop and have it perform a set amount of watts, seconds, or energy? It can be done because you can construct the coils in proportion with the octave progression of the wave on the bench. This is very cool. We need to talk about power multiplication because this is what's going on. This is why the coils are doing what they're doing, and this also explains why bar magnets do what they do. On the bottom, you see just what you would consider a flat bar magnet. You see that the end poles do something. They will attract nails or pick up iron filings and so forth, but only at the end poles. There's zero attraction at the middle of the magnet. What's actually happening is there's an optical effect occurring which multiplies by biconvex lenses. The expansion, as I was saying, that occurs is a two-dimensional plane. That's why there's a zero attraction. It's too expanded to perform any kind of usable work at this point. It has to be contracted from the outside toward the inside, and that's what the lenses do, spherical optical lenses. The electricity runs through the bar magnet and polarizes it. That's all it does, is it polarizes it. It extends equally in both directions from the zero of the equilibrium in the middle. And it focalizes or focuses to these points which are the square of the distance from each other and the cube in volume. So here we have the law of squares telling us exactly how the end poles of the magnet come to be so strong relative to the center, which is absolutely dead zero, nothing. So they have this, he calls it a cathode pole. This is an equal extension to the actual physical length of the magnet. Now, this optical curvature that occurs here also accounts for why when you spread iron filings around the magnet that you see these curved lines, and they've called these magnetic lines of force. The best way I can explain this is if you've ever skimmed a pool, when you stick the pole through the water at right where the surface of the water is, it breaks at an angle to your eyes. This is because the density of the air and the density of the liquid are different, and it forms a gradient. This gradient bends light optically. This is exactly the same reason why the magnetic lines of force bend to the equator and to the poles, because there is a gradient of potential of compression at the poles and expansion in the middle of the magnet. This is all optics. It doesn't have anything to do with magnetic lines of force. It's a density gradient which produces curvature, the same reason that the pole will break at the surface of the water. So we're dealing with optics, and since we know that we can take the lens, a biconvex lens, and focus it to a point, the focal point at the end of the bar magnet actually does something useful, just from compression. So let's relate this to something Tesla said. He wrote an article called Our Future Motive Power. This is the diagram on the right that he's suggesting. He's saying stick this large thing down in the earth. Now, if you get closer to the center of the earth, does it get hot? Sure does. And it's going to send that steam back up to run the alternator, and then you can put it into a condenser, recondense the steam into liquid water, and feed it back into itself. Now, imagine if you could do this without having to sink this thing so far down into the earth. Well, if you know how to project heat out of cold, which is what the coils do, then you can essentially make this a closed-loop system where the steam runs the alternator, recondenses through a condenser into liquid water, and is fed back in. So the water actually mimics the hydrological cycle on the Earth. And we're using the coil as an induction heating source instead of the sun. So this concept of copying nature to perform usable work for us is something that we need to seriously think about. And Walter supplied us with this concept of how to do it, and Tesla's supplying us with how you make it a closed-loop hydrological cycle. Thank you. I'm going to move a little bit quicker now. Similarities, I want to talk for a minute about the magnifying transmitter. Tesla said, out of all my inventions, the magnifying transmitter will be the most important and valuable for future generations. We should probably pay attention to that, since he basically gave us our modern electrical age. This is from one of the patents, art of transmitting electrical energy through the natural medium. Basically, Tesla's saying, you don't have to read all this, I found it practical to produce in this manner an electrical moment thousands of times greater than the initial. That's basically a way of saying, I'm getting more out than I'm putting in. Why does that happen? The coil, the secondary coil, well, first of all, let's consider the primary. The primary encompasses large circumference. It's encapsulating out a region of space and making potential, because as the current moves through it, there are sequences of evacuation and compression which make a gradient of high pressure on the inside, low pressure on the outside. This is all you need to create power. Russell's showing you the optical effect. Again, if you think about the biconvex lens, you can focus energy to a central point. Tesla uses a capacitive discharge to run the primary circuit. The secondary is not inductively coupled to the primary, only these few turns that are really, really close to it. The rest of the coupling happens just from the movement from the outside toward the inside. This is the direction in which power multiplies. So this makes sense that if the coil occupies one equator and is wound from the outside toward the inside, that the potential will multiply as it moves toward the center. And you can have iron core here or air core, it doesn't really matter. Tesla would ground this one, meaning that the ground potential of the Earth would actually come in and multiply and then be ejected up into the elevated capacity to be sent wirelessly. This is the basis of his wireless system, but I believe that this can actually be used just to generate huge amounts of power using, again, this optical photosynthetic process. I'm going to move real quick through this. The secondary coil can be conical. Have we seen that before? He also used a double coil. This is in the same patent. Tesla was cheeky. He just said that this is an electrical transformer. It's a split coil. Do you see? One thing I want to point out about this is that if these two coils are wound oppositely, meaning one clockwise, one counterclockwise with a center tap, if you put these coils in parallel and they're exactly the same resistance, you've actually doubled the number of turns, but you've taken the resistance, say this is 8 ohms, you've divided it in half, now you have 4. You have 2 of them in parallel, divide by 2, you have 2 ohms resistance. You've lowered the resistance, which allows the increase of the current. You've also doubled the number of the turns. This makes for an extremely efficient secondary coil. This is part of the reason that he was able to generate such high potential differences in his resonant transformers. You can see the discharge from the crown, the apex of the cone, as it multiplies from the base towards the apex. Finally, I've seen this coil pop up a few different places. Tesla's basically saying a secondary coil constructed in this manner has many important advantages, the chief one being safety and handling and the facility it affords for obtaining potentials far beyond those producibles if ordinary methods of construction are followed. He's basically saying this coil is way better than a single wound direction coil. It'll produce much higher potential differences. And why would that happen? Because everything is created in pairs. Clockwise and anti-clockwise unite to form high potential gravitative radiative center in between. This is, again, as we said, this is how matter is born. The two-way opposed direction system, which nature relentlessly makes use of in its every effect, versus our inefficient one-way wiring system, which ignores the fact that nature first divides by opposing before it multiplies by uniting. This happens in the color spectrum. Why shouldn't it happen in transformers or solenoid coils? There's no difference. Final image here. This is a bi-cone secondary coil that Tesla created. This is a resonant transformer. This image on the left is from atomic suicide. Walter's showing you basically exactly the same coil that Tesla used, center tapped as well, meaning negative in the middle, both ends are positive. And most of the time Tesla would just discharge these things. He wasn't really running loads with them. He just liked to, make sparks. So I want to show you just a few experiments that I've done just to finish up. You can take these cones, you can wind coils on them. It's a little difficult, but you can do it. In this case, I'm actually snapping ferrite magnets on the base of the cones. You can see that you get, what do you get at the equator? Expansion, just like the rings of Saturn. They move outward from the center to the outward direction. There's another view of the same thing. These are suspended in midair only by the presence of the magnets. So, as I said, if you can create heat from light with no moving parts just by using a biconvex lens, why wouldn't a solenoid or a conical steel core do exactly the same thing? It'll create high pressure at the center, which our senses will interpret as heat, or for our purposes, energy. And with that, I'm done. I'll take some questions. Please visit philosophy.org. We have lots of stuff there. You can donate to science and research. We're doing lots of really, really cool stuff with this information. We have lots of images, lots of free goodies up there for you to look at if you're really interested. And please buy some books if you want to know more about this, because I've only touched the surface with all of this. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Darren Colomb. Are there any questions? We do have a question.
Hi, Darren. Thanks a lot. You know, so much has I thought you said something. Sorry. My name's Trish, and I'm from Canada. And you know, I think this work is really important. And one of the big reasons why I'm here is because I think there needs to be a collaboration. And this is such an essential part to a missing equation for just about every single presentation I've seen thus far, really. And there's actually a number of people I implored earlier this morning to come and watch this presentation because I think that they need it and it needs them. My question is, because to me, particularly in your presentation, the whole thing has occurred to me as the eye. What I know about optics, and my question to you is, have you ever collaborated with, or has there ever been a master of ophthalmology or optics of the eye, of the human eye, that has worked with you on this particular research and philosophy?
I haven't worked with anybody. For the longest time, I studied this science in absolutely on my own, just in my own thoughts. A lot of the work that you have to do to understand this just comes from your own internal experiences, the introspection. One of the things about the eye that I noticed is, first of all, the lens itself is curved. So whenever you see a straight line in reality, it's going to enter through the optic curvature in the eye, and so it's actually always curved. Every line that you see is always curved. And furthermore, there's a cone. If you can see, I wish I had a diagram of the eye, but there's a cone that projects to a point and then reverses and expands so that it hits the retina in the back. And that point where the nexus is, where one cone becomes contracted and then expanded, is an infinitesimally small point, which means that all dimension, for however large the universe appears to be, within the eye, it is minute. It's microscopic. It's tiny. That is the point within the eye in which the entire universe exists, because it has to be reversed and reflected in the back of the retina before it becomes electrical vision. So what is very, very large is also simultaneously extremely small, or dimensionless, you could say. That's what I love about the eye.
This is more of a comment than a question. I'm struck by the fact that this unit of motion seems to be a fundamental underlying his most of his theory. Are you familiar with reciprocal system theory? Have you ever seen that?
D.B. Larson?
Yeah, D.B. Larson. This has remarkable similarities, and of course he doesn't get into the exotic mathematics or anything else. He goes through a straightforward thing, but he has some very different outcomes. Time, for example, is a dimension, and gravity is a push and a pull and all this kind of thing. I mean, if you go through it, he quit working on it. I don't think anybody is. A couple of years ago we had a presentation, but it wasn't really didn't really describe it very well. It's quite an elaborate thing. Are you familiar with it?
I've taken a look at his work. I studied lots of things before I sort of finally settled on Russell, because I felt like his explanation, or his exposition, I should say, is more complete than anything I've ever found. D.B. Larson points out many what we would call fundamentals, just things that are inherently basic to what we can observe about reality. I haven't gone that deep into his work. I've sort of tried to make myself a service and a resource for the University of Science and Philosophy, because there's an enormous amount of material that Walter produced, and not all of it is available and not all of it was understood. And I'm trying to do a lot of that work and make it easy for people to access the real gold mine that I believe is here as a scientist, because I think it is valid, and I think it merits further work.
I'd like to talk to you offline about one or two little things. Yeah.
Sure.
Any further questions? Oh, we've got another.
I'm currently working on a translation of Kervran's unpublished Preuves en géologie and biologie of transmutations of Hebel and Ilshi. I wondered what you thought of the relationship of Kervran's work to Russell's work.
Well, Russell's showing us that the elements, the reason he was able to change the ratio of gases, for example, using a device, is because he understood that the elements occupy a gyroscopic relationship relative to the amplitude of the wave and the equator. Between that 90 degrees are angular relationships where the elements are actually occupying. It's pressure within an enclosed environment. In the human body, we must be doing exactly the same thing. We are manipulating the relationship between the equator and the polar axis of the atomic structure itself and transmuting at will, especially the elements like calcium, magnesium, the ones which are really essential. It's a miracle that you can eat such a crappy diet and yet you don't have a manifestation of mineral deficiency until sometimes decades later, which kind of proves the point that whatever you are taking in as raw material, the body is pliable and plastic enough to actually be able to transmute those elements into something that it absolutely needs and is essential, such as sodium and potassium and so on.
So it's all wave phase change.
It's all waves through light. And the body's made of light anyways. Yeah. Oh boy. Oh yeah. The raffle.
We took some tickets. People got in, so we're going to have Vernon, if you will. Would you draw a ticket out of here? Yeah.
2114. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wow. There we go. Lisa Trujillo. Do we have a Lisa Trujillo?
You do not have to be present to win. So
Oh, fantastic. Good deal.
Lisa will get a phone call, and we'll send one of each of those books to her.
Yeah, and I, as I said before, I highly recommend purchasing the books. They'll give you a lot more than what I gave you today. And stay tuned to the university. We're working on this technology actively. This is something that's always going on, and we have lots of really exciting things happening. So if you'd like to be involved or you'd like to just know more, please feel free to come talk to us. We'd be happy to talk to you.
We have one more question.
Hi, Darren. So I'm trying to relate all of these things that I've learned this weekend. I loved the way it was expressed about both positive with pulling into that negative center. In terms of all of these, like in the beginning, you had a slide that said, these are his terms and you can relate them to many terms.
Right.
Is that center area potentially a scalar field? Can I relate it in that way or no? Am I off?
As long as the term at its root means equilibrium or non-opposition.
That's the way I understand it, or the way I've extrapolated it through my
Right.
direct experience.
Walter even created words. He had to invent certain words
Sure.
because the language of light hadn't really been discussed yet. So when you hear him say something like general active, this is simply an inverse word that is converse to radioactive, because radioactive can't be the only existent thing. There has to be a compensative force as well.
Right.
So you can almost take any word that means a process or a thing which is happening and invert it, and you will have the mirror opposite, because you can, as I've said before, you can't create one without the other.
Okay.
Darren Colomb, thank you for that illuminating presentation.